The year was 1943. Across the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Pacific, war thundered in every direction. The skies above the Solomon Islands had become a graveyard of burned metal and shattered wings. Amid that chaos, one particular wreck would soon draw the attention of American pilots. A sleek, strange bomber unlike anything they had ever seen. It was discovered after a ferocious air battle near Bougainville. U.S. patrols combing through the jungle stumbled upon the twisted remains of what Japanese airmen had called the Mitsubishi G4M, or as Allied forces nicknamed it, the Betty. At first glance, it didn't look like much. Just another destroyed enemy aircraft lying half-hidden under palm leaves and smoke. But as engineers and intelligence officers approached, they realized this was something rare. A relatively intact enemy bomber, one that could finally reveal the secrets behind Japan's long-range strikes. Until then, American pilots had only seen the Betty in combat, blazing through the sky, carrying torpedoes toward Allied ships, often exploding into a fireball after just a few hits. They had heard rumors that the plane had no self-sealing fuel tanks, that even a tracer round could turn it into a flying inferno. But now, for the first time, they could see it up close, and what they found both shocked and fascinated them. The aircraft's body was impossibly thin. The fuselage felt fragile, its aluminum skin barely thicker than a soda can. There was no armor plating to protect the crew. The interior smelled of burned aviation fuel and charred bamboo mats. A strange combination of advanced engineering and desperate improvisation. It was hard to believe that such a delicate machine had once crossed hundreds of miles of open ocean, carrying deadly torpedoes toward American fleets. Nearby, a team of Navy mechanics began carefully examining the wings and fuel system. They expected to find rubber-lined tanks, the kind used in U.S. bombers to prevent catastrophic fires. Instead, they found nothing, just bare metal fuel cells, completely unprotected. One pilot, staring in disbelief, muttered, "No wonder they light up like Christmas trees." The discovery sent waves through the intelligence community. Why would Japan, a nation capable of building formidable warships and fierce fighters like the Zero, send its bomber crews into battle in machines so defenseless? Was it arrogance, desperation, or something else entirely? As engineers disassembled the aircraft piece by piece, the answer began to emerge. The Betty had been built for one thing: range. The Japanese Navy demanded a bomber that could fly farther than any Allied counterpart, capable of striking distant targets across the Pacific without refueling. To achieve that, designers stripped away everything non-essential: armor, protection, and even the self-sealing tanks that other nations considered standard. It was a brutal kind of logic, speed, and reach over survival. Every ounce of weight saved meant more fuel, more distance, and more chance to hit first. But it also meant that every hit was fatal. Standing beside the wreck, one American officer quietly took notes in his field book. He knew this captured bomber would soon be shipped to the mainland for testing. Yet even then, he couldn't help but feel a strange respect and pity for the men who had flown it. Brave pilots, sent on impossible missions in a machine that offered them almost no chance of coming home. By nightfall, the wreckage of the Betty was loaded onto a transport ship bound for the United States. What the Americans would learn from that fragile bomber would shape their understanding of Japan's air power and reveal just how far the enemy was willing to go in pursuit of range and reach. The Pacific War was still raging, but in the dense jungles of Bougainville, the first clues to Japan's design philosophy had just been uncovered, and with it a haunting truth. Sometimes, in the race for power, survival becomes the first casualty. When the captured Mitsubishi G4M, Betty, finally arrived at an Allied airfield, a quiet crowd gathered around it. Pilots, engineers, and intelligence officers stood in silence, studying the bomber that had once terrorized convoys across the Pacific. To most, it looked nothing like the enemy aircraft they had fought in the skies. Under the harsh tropical sun, the plane's fuselage gleamed like a silver blade, long, smooth, and unnervingly thin. The wings stretched gracefully outward, almost fragile in appearance. One American mechanic whispered, "It looks fast, but it also looks like it shouldn't even fly." The first inspection began early the next morning. Teams from both the U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces surrounded the Betty, clipboards in hand. The air still carried the faint smell of gasoline and sea salt, remnants of its journey from the jungle. Every rivet, every wire, every gauge told a story. When they climbed into the cockpit, the Americans were surprised by its simplicity. The instruments were clean but basic, nothing like the crowded dashboards of a B-25 or B-17. The control yokes were thin, the seats unarmored. There were no bulletproof glass panels, no steel plates behind the pilot's seat. Even the floor panels felt light and hollow. One engineer tapped the fuselage with his knuckle. It made a hollow metallic ring. Then came the real shock, the fuel system. The tanks sat directly between the crew and the engines, fully exposed, with no rubber lining or protection of any kind. "This thing's a flying gas can," muttered one of the test officers. And he wasn't wrong. Allied pilots had long noticed that Japanese bombers erupted into fire after the lightest hit, and now they finally understood why. But despite its fragility, there was a strange brilliance in its design. The Betty was astonishingly light. It carried enormous fuel capacity for its size, allowing it to reach targets hundreds of miles away and still return to base. The engines, twin Mitsubishi Kase 14 cylinders, were remarkably efficient. The Americans realized that this aircraft had been designed with one uncompromising goal: range above all else. A test pilot from Wright Field walked around the bomber, noting how the landing gear retracted inward, how the tail gun position offered wide coverage but no armor. "They built it for offense, not survival," he remarked. "It's fast, it's lean, and it's suicidal." During the next few days, the Betty was carefully restored to flight condition for testing. As mechanics patched bullet holes and replaced missing panels, word spread across the base. Everyone wanted to see the Japanese bomber take to the air again. When the engines finally roared to life, the ground shook with a deep, throaty hum. The sound was smooth and powerful, but the thin airframe rattled like a tin drum. As it lifted off the runway for the first time under American control, officers watched in awe. The plane climbed gracefully, its long wings slicing through the sky with effortless elegance. It was beautiful and deadly in its own way, yet every man who watched knew that a single burst of tracer fire would have turned it into a burning comet. When it landed, the pilot stepped out and removed his headset. "It handles like a dream," he said quietly, "but it's made of paper." The engineers recorded every detail: the climb rate, the turn radius, the engine temperatures. Intelligence officers compiled notes for Washington, insights that would help the U.S. understand the Japanese approach to aircraft design. It wasn't incompetence that made the Betty so vulnerable. It was philosophy. The Japanese valued speed, range, and striking power even at the cost of their crews' lives. That realization changed the tone of the entire investigation. What had begun as curiosity turned into respect. A somber respect for the pilots who had flown these fragile machines into battle, knowing how easily they could burn. The Betty was more than just a captured bomber now. It was a window into the enemy's mind, a reflection of a nation that fought with daring, precision, and sacrifice, even when the odds were impossible. And as the last light of day faded across the runway, the metallic silhouette of the Betty glowed softly in the dusk, a haunting reminder that brilliance and tragedy often fly on the same wings. In the years before the Pacific War, Japan's aviation engineers faced an impossible challenge: to build aircraft that could strike across the ocean's endless distances and still return home. Their empire stretched thinly across islands scattered thousands of miles apart. Fuel was scarce. Bases were few. Every mission demanded range, and range demanded sacrifice. Inside Mitsubishi's design offices in Nagoya, the air buzzed with ambition and anxiety. It was 1939. The Imperial Navy had called for a new bomber, one that could reach as far as 2,000 miles without refueling, faster than any Allied aircraft of its class. The team, led by engineer Kiro Hanjo, knew exactly what that meant. Armor would have to go. Weight would have to vanish. Every kilogram removed would buy a few more miles of ocean. The result was the Mitsubishi G4M, a masterpiece of minimalist engineering. Its long, thin wings gave it an extraordinary range. Its streamlined fuselage reduced drag to a whisper. The twin engines were powerful yet fuel-efficient. On paper, it was perfect, the ultimate naval bomber. But behind that brilliance lay a silent cost. Hanjo and his team knew the truth. There was no room for armor plating, no weight allowance for self-sealing fuel tanks. When they presented the design to the Navy, one officer reportedly asked, "How will it survive enemy fire?" Hanjo replied, "It will not be hit because it will be fast." It was a statement of faith and perhaps of denial. That belief that offense was the best defense became the foundation of Japan's air doctrine. Their aircraft would not endure enemy fire. They would avoid it entirely. This mindset also shaped the legendary Zero fighter. Fast, agile, and terrifyingly light. In both cases, the Japanese sacrificed protection for agility and range, and for a time it worked. When war erupted in 1941, Betty bombers struck with stunning reach. From Rabaul, they attacked ships around New Guinea and the Philippines. Their range shocked Allied commanders. American and Australian bases once thought safe suddenly found themselves within reach of Japanese bombers. It was a triumph of design and of daring. But as the war dragged on, the weaknesses of that philosophy began to burn, quite literally. Allied fighters soon learned that a single burst of gunfire could ignite a Betty in midair. Fuel tanks placed along the fuselage turned the plane into a torch. Pilots called them one-shot lighters. Japanese crews flew knowing the odds, but their sense of duty outweighed fear. Still, Japan's engineers could not simply change course. Their industry lacked the aluminum and rubber resources needed to build heavier, protected aircraft. Every improvement meant trade-offs they couldn't afford. The Betty's vulnerability wasn't just a choice. It was a consequence of Japan's limited wartime economy. Within Japan, some engineers quietly questioned the doctrine. They saw the loss of hundreds of bombers and thousands of airmen as proof that range at all costs was no longer sustainable. Yet the Imperial Navy demanded speed and distance above all else. In a culture where obedience and sacrifice were honored virtues, few dared to argue. By 1944, even as the tide of war turned against them, Japan continued producing lighter, faster aircraft, chasing the same ideal that had defined their early victories. But the skies had changed. The Allies now ruled the air with heavily armored planes. In that new reality, the old philosophy had become fatal. The story of the Betty is, in many ways, the story of Japan's wartime engineering itself, brilliant, daring, and ultimately doomed by its own ambition. It was born from necessity and driven by faith in the pilot's skill and spirit, rather than the machine's protection. When American engineers later studied the captured Betty, they realized they weren't just examining a plane, they were examining a mindset. Every bolt and rivet reflected a nation's belief that speed, sacrifice, and precision could overcome material weakness. But in the relentless logic of war, ideals cannot stop bullets. and the skies over the Pacific would soon prove that even the most elegant design philosophy can turn into a deadly illusion. When the captured Betty bomber was finally shipped to Wright Field in the United States, a team of top American engineers gathered to take it apart, piece by piece. For them, it was more than curiosity. It was a mission to understand how Japan had built a bomber that could fly so far and die so easily. From the outside, the aircraft looked sleek, almost beautiful, its long wings and narrow fuselage giving it the grace of a glider. But as the inspection began, that beauty quickly gave way to disbelief. Every engineer who touched the plane realized something was terribly wrong. The aluminum skin was paper-thin, in some places barely a millimeter thick. The wiring was fragile, with little shielding against heat or shrapnel. The oxygen lines ran dangerously close to the fuel tanks. The self-sealing coating that protected Allied bombers from fire was completely absent. And then came the most shocking discovery of all, the fuel tanks themselves. They were massive, filling the wings and much of the fuselage, holding thousands of liters of high-octane aviation fuel. Yet there was no armor, no rubber lining, no safety barrier. Just raw aluminum containers waiting to ignite. The Americans stood in silence for a moment. One of them finally muttered, "It's like they built it out of gasoline and prayer." In combat, the results had been catastrophic. U.S. pilots had already noticed that Betty bombers exploded the moment they were hit. Now, the engineers saw exactly why. A single tracer round could pierce the tank, and the hot metal would ignite the vapor instantly. No crew could escape such an inferno. As they mapped the structure, the Americans realized how many design compromises had been made to save weight. Even the crew's defensive positions were exposed. The tail gunner sat in a thin bubble of glass with no armor behind him. The side gunners had nothing but metal frames between them and enemy fire. It was engineering brilliance twisted by necessity. Reports from the Pacific confirmed it. Japanese bomber crews called their own planes hamaki, the flying cigar, because once it caught fire, it burned from nose to tail in seconds. Some crews even carried sidearms, not to fight the enemy, but to end their suffering if the bomber was hit. It was a grim reality born from the cold logic of design. For the engineers at Wright Field, this wasn't just a technical analysis, it was an autopsy. They began drafting reports comparing the Betty to Allied aircraft like the B-25 Mitchell and B-26 Marauder. Those bombers were slower, heavier, and shorter ranged, but they protected their crews with armor, compartmentalized fuel tanks, and redundant systems. In contrast, the Betty had sacrificed everything for range. Some of the American engineers couldn't help but feel a strange respect for the Japanese designers. Within the limits of their resources, they had achieved something extraordinary, a bomber that could strike thousands of miles from its base, long before Allied planes had similar reach. But it had come at a terrible cost. Inside the hangar, one test pilot walked slowly around the stripped-down fuselage. "It's genius," he said quietly, "and insanity at the same time." The aircraft represented both Japan's technological ingenuity and its fatal flaw, the belief that courage and precision could replace protection. As they completed their report, the engineers gave the Betty a final nickname, an engineer's nightmare, not because it was poorly built, but because it was the kind of design that no engineer wanted to see go to war. Every rule of survivability had been broken. Every ounce of safety had been sacrificed for ambition. By the end of the analysis, the Americans understood something deeper than measurements and schematics. They saw a reflection of Japan's wartime desperation, a nation stretched beyond its industrial limits, clinging to speed and faith instead of armor and steel. When the final test flight concluded, the Betty landed smoothly under the bright Ohio sky. The pilot stepped out, removed his helmet, and said what everyone was thinking. "It flies beautifully, but it was never meant to survive." And with that, The hangar fell silent. The nightmare of Japanese engineering wasn't just a story of machines. It was a story of men, of choices, and of the deadly price of perfection pursued without protection. The Pacific skies of 1942 and 1943 burned brighter than any sunset. American and Japanese pilots alike learned that once a Betty appeared on the horizon, fire would soon follow, one way or another. For the Japanese Navy, the Mitsubishi G4M had been their proud long-range strike weapon, capable of carrying a torpedo hundreds of miles to find its target. But in combat, that pride quickly turned into tragedy. The plane's beautiful design became a death trap the moment enemy fighters appeared. The first real test came over the Solomon Islands. In the summer heat of 1942, formations of Betty bombers roared toward Allied ships near Guadalcanal. They flew in tight, perfect formation, shimmering specks against the deep blue sky. But waiting for them were American F-4F Wildcats and P-38 Lightnings. As the first bursts of machine gun fire tore through the formation, the results were horrifying. One tracer round, just one, would pierce a wing, and within seconds the bomber would erupt in orange flames. The sky turned into a burning graveyard. Exploding fuel tanks sent black smoke spiraling thousands of feet upward. Pilots who managed to bail out were often engulfed before their parachutes could even open. The Americans watching from below could hardly believe what they were seeing. One Marine gunner described it later. They didn't just go down, they disappeared in fire. At Rabaul, one of Japan's largest air bases, reports of losses poured in. Entire bomber crews failed to return. The Navy began to realize what its engineers already knew. The Betty was fast, but it was far too fragile for the new reality of air combat. Yet missions continued. Japan had no replacement, and every pilot knew it. Among them was Lieutenant Commander Takashi Okumiya, who later wrote, "We flew knowing that one bullet could end us, but our duty was to reach the target, not to come home." His words captured the mindset of a generation. Brave men sent into the sky inside machines that offered them no mercy. The Allies learned to exploit the Betty's weakness ruthlessly. In the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in 1943, American and Australian fighters intercepted waves of Bettys attempting to defend a Japanese convoy. Out of dozens launched, almost none survived the engagement. Many were hit before they even reached the target zone, exploding in midair long before their torpedoes could drop. To the Americans, the sight became almost routine. A flash of gunfire, a burst of flame, then nothing. Pilots began calling them flying Zippos or flaming coffins. It was brutal slang for a brutal truth. Yet for all its vulnerability, the Betty was still feared. Its long range allowed it to strike unexpectedly, and when it hit hard. In 1942, it was Betty bombers that helped sink the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse, proving that even fragile machines could be deadly in skilled hands. But the price of that reach was unbearable. By 1944, Japan had lost thousands of G4MS and tens of thousands of aircrew. Most missions ended the same way, a brilliant flash in the distance, then silence. The aircraft that once symbolized Japan's offensive power had become a symbol of sacrifice and loss. In their final missions, some Bettys were used as kamikaze escorts, guiding suicide pilots toward American fleets. Even then, they burned just as easily, vanishing in the same tragic blaze that had defined their entire service life. For American pilots who fought them, the image of the Betty was unforgettable. A silver ghost that appeared suddenly, fought fiercely, and always died in fire. And for the Japanese who flew them, it became a symbol of courage and fatalism, proof of how far they were willing to go for their nation's cause. When the war finally ended, the Pacific sky grew quiet again. But those who had seen it remembered. The trails of black smoke, the flashes of light, and the haunting knowledge that every explosion meant another crew lost. The Betty had achieved everything it was designed for: speed, range, striking power, and failed in the only thing that mattered most: survival. In the end, the Mitsubishi G4M left behind not just wreckage and statistics, but a warning written in fire across the Pacific sky that brilliance without protection is a path to destruction. When the war machine of Japan finally showed its cracks, the Allies saw an opportunity to learn from the very weapon that had once terrorized them. The captured Mitsubishi G4M Betty, shipped from the Pacific to the testing grounds of Wright Field, Ohio, became one of the most valuable trophies of the air war. For American intelligence officers, this was not just another piece of wreckage. It was a chance to understand how Japan thought, how they built, and how they fought. Every rivet, every instrument, every panel held a clue. When the bomber arrived, its sleek lines immediately caught the attention of U.S. engineers. They admired its range and efficiency, how it achieved flight distances that no American bomber of similar size could match. The question was no longer how did it burn so easily, but how did it fly so far? Engineers from the Air Technical Intelligence Command began an exhaustive study. They drained the fuel tanks, measured the wingspan, calculated the weight-to-power ratio. To their surprise, the math revealed a kind of brilliance. The Betty's low-drag fuselage and high-efficiency engines allowed it to cover enormous distances with remarkable fuel economy. It was, in many ways, the perfect design for Japan's geography, an empire spread thin across islands separated by endless ocean. Test flights soon followed. American pilots took the controls, carefully bringing the aircraft to life. The twin Mitsubishi Kase engines rumbled smoothly, pushing the plane down the runway. In the air, it handled beautifully, light, responsive, agile for its size. One test pilot compared it to flying a sports car with wings. But beneath that admiration lay unease. "It's too light," another pilot said. "You can feel it wants to come apart." In debriefings, engineers noted both brilliance and tragedy in the design. The lack of armor made it nimble. The absence of protection gave it range. But those same features turned it into a coffin in combat. It was the purest example of design driven by desperation. The intelligence community compiled thick reports detailing every discovery. American manufacturers studied the Betty's engine layout, its fuel efficiency methods, and even its simplified instrument design. Some of these lessons quietly influenced post-war aircraft development, particularly in lightweight materials and aerodynamics. But the most important lesson wasn't technical. It was psychological. The U.S. analysts came to understand the mindset of Japan's aviation doctrine, the belief that courage and precision could replace armor and safety. For the Americans, who had invested heavily in survivability, this was both fascinating and sobering. The captured bomber became a teaching tool. At flight schools and engineering briefings, instructors pointed to the Betty's design as a warning, proof that innovation without balance leads to disaster. Its photos appeared in military reports titled "Lessons from the Enemy." In one test session, an American colonel reportedly ran his hand along the thin fuselage and said quietly, "They built this knowing their men would die in it." The room fell silent. It wasn't mockery, it was respect. Respect for the engineers who did their best with limited resources, and for the aircrews who flew knowing their odds of survival were almost none. By 1945, as the war neared its end, more captured Bettys were examined in Australia, the Philippines, and even Hawaii. Each test confirmed the same story: incredible range, fragile structure, and tragic vulnerability. After Japan's surrender, several G4MS were repainted in white and used to transport Japanese envoys to surrender negotiations, a symbolic end for an aircraft that had once carried destruction across the Pacific. The same design that had burned so often now carried the message of peace. For the Americans who had studied it, the Betty remained a haunting symbol of both brilliance and futility. It taught them that war was not only fought with weapons, but with ideas, and that understanding your enemy's mind was often more valuable than destroying his machines. In the quiet hangars of Wright Field, the last remaining Betty sat on its landing gear, silent and scarred from years of flight and fire. Engineers walked past it every day, reminded of a simple truth: you can build a plane to fly far, but if it cannot bring its crew home, it will never truly succeed. In the vast blue expanse of the Pacific, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber became both a nightmare and a legend. Allied pilots learned to recognize it by silhouette alone: the long, narrow fuselage, the twin engines, and that haunting glint of sunlight reflecting off its unarmored skin. It was fragile, yet it struck with deadly precision. To the men who fought in the skies, the Betty represented a paradox. It was feared not because it was strong, but because the men flying it were unrelenting. American pilots often said, "If you see a Betty coming, it won't turn away, even if it's burning." That attitude defined Japan's air war in the Pacific. The Betty wasn't built for survival. It was built for the mission. Japanese crews knew their odds were slim. Many missions ended with fiery deaths over the sea. Yet they launched anyway. Their loyalty to the emperor, their sense of duty, and their code of Bushido made them press on where logic said to turn back. One U.S. Marine pilot recalled watching a damaged Betty continue flying straight toward his formation, flames trailing from its right wing. It didn't attempt to escape. Instead, it lined up for a final attack before exploding in midair. "It was like watching courage destroy itself," he said later. That image haunted him for years. Among the Allied ranks, the Betty earned nicknames like the Flying Cigar and the One-Shot Lighter. Pilots knew that a single burst from a .50 caliber machine gun could ignite its massive fuel tanks. But they also knew the Betty was fast, deceptively fast, and could deliver devastating blows when escorted by fighters. In early 1942, the Betty's reputation reached its peak during the fall of the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. It was the Betty bombers that struck Prince of Wales and Repulse, two proud British warships, sending them to the bottom of the South China Sea. The first time capital ships were sunk by air power alone. That moment changed naval warfare forever. The U.S. Navy took note. Fear gave way to respect. Commanders began studying the Betty's tactics and adjusting their formations, spacing, and anti-aircraft fire patterns. The bomber's success forced the Allies to adapt, and in that sense it became an unintentional teacher. By mid-1943, however, the tide began to turn. The introduction of new American fighters, the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair, brought dominance to the skies. The Betty's vulnerabilities were brutally exposed. Pilots reported entire formations of Japanese bombers shot down before they could release a single torpedo. Yet even in defeat, the Betty crews rarely broke formation. They died as they flew, disciplined, silent, and unwavering. There was a strange kind of respect that developed between enemies. American pilots, who once laughed at the Betty's lack of protection, began to admire the spirit of the men inside it. They recognized something human in their courage, the same drive that pushed all airmen to climb into fragile machines and gamble their lives at 20,000 feet. By late 1944, the Betty's role had shifted. With Japan losing air superiority, the bomber became a desperate weapon of last resort, carrying suicide pilots or transporting commanders in increasingly dangerous skies. Its green camouflage, once a symbol of Japan's reach, now blended into the jungles it could no longer protect. When the war ended and white-painted Bettys were used to carry surrender envoys, American pilots escorted them, this time not as enemies, but as witnesses to history. The same aircraft that had once delivered death now carried peace. One U.S. pilot later wrote, It felt like watching a ghost find rest. The Betty story left a deep mark on those who fought in the Pacific. It symbolized both the genius and the tragedy of Japan's wartime aviation, a machine that achieved greatness at the cost of its own survival. In the years that followed, veterans spoke of the Betty with a tone that mixed awe and melancholy. They didn't fear it anymore, but they never forgot it, because in that fragile airplane, wrapped in thin aluminum and filled with volatile fuel, they saw the essence of the Pacific War itself: bravery, sacrifice, and the thin line between brilliance and destruction.